Hello everyone. In the second video lecture, I will present to you an account of the late Neolithic and Chalcolithic regional cultures in Western Asia. So last week, as you will recall, we studied the early Neolithic settlements both before the domestication of plants and animals and after. And those before sites actually included the Göbekli Tepe site on the upper left, and then the after sites includes the agricultural settlement at Chalcolithic on the lower right. And so while Göbekli Tepe, at Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists did not find any houses, and it seemed to be the only thing they have was the ceremonial kind of circular structures with no evidence for agriculture. In the same region, archaeologists found another site called Neolithic, that you see a reconstruction on the upper right, where Neolithic actually shared these kind of ceremonial structures with T-shaped pillars with Göbekli Tepe, but they also had small houses that had evidence for agriculture. So it seems that this is a kind of, from Göbekli Tepe to Neolithic, we're seeing a transition into agricultural life. And we looked at Chalcolithic down below, an agriculturalist sort of permanent settlement on the right. And what's really interesting is that I'm showing you another Neolithic site, just as an example, from Cyprus, the site of Kirokitea from Cyprus, which has which is roughly contemporary to Chalcolithic, but has a very different sort of architecture. As you can see, instead of these sort of really joined mud brick structures, they had these kind of really stone-built beehive formed circular structures clustered around a paved street. So very different architecture, very different layout. So that means that these Neolithic settlements were really living in their own worlds and had maybe little to no interaction between them. So what we're going to do in this class is, this lecture is actually to look beyond, and so into the late Neolithic and early Chalcolithic, and talk about how different sites actually start to talk to each other, start to form regional identities, regional associations. And our main evidence for this is really going to be pottery, and I'll talk about it in a little bit. This map shows some of those cultural clusters. On the left, that yellow area by the Mediterranean is known as the Amukbi sort of cultural complex. On the right, we see the green area is the Hasuna culture that unites a series of settlements, and then on the and then that large blob, orange blob, is the Samara, which is slightly later actually than the Hasuna period, and we see a kind of an intersection between the two, and so. By their affiliation is by their material culture, including ceramics, architecture, figurines, the technologies of production that they used, and so I want to really briefly talk a little bit about how important the study in our study of material culture, how important pottery is for archaeologists. So whether they are baked or unbaked, or fired or not fired, wheel made or handmade, decorated or undecorated, sort of whether it's for storage or whether it's for cooking or for serving. the evidence, our most distinctive evidence to identify these regional affiliations is pottery, is ceramics. And in the field, when you're doing field work in archaeology, about 95% of the materials that you collect and study is actually pottery. And so we look at their technologies of making. For example, what kind of materials are they putting into the clay, into the ware? How are they firing? What technologies are they using to fire these pots? How are they decorating them? How are they shaping them? What kind of shapes are they? Is it a jar? Is it a bowl? Is it an amphora? Is it a vessel? Is it so there are these kind of, is it a cup, right? So all these things are kind of really provide us a great variety of aspects of ceramics that we can use dating the sites, but also study their symbolic meaning, but also study their use, their eating culture, and so on. And sometimes archaeologists find residues, food residues in the bottom of each of these vessels, and then you can study that food residue and understand what they were eating, right? And so so this is really, that's why ceramics is really, what I wanted to say is that it's the bread and butter of archaeological work, or field archaeology particularly. So and as J.L. Myers wrote in 1923, all objects of pottery are the figment of potter's will, fictions of his memory, and imagination. And so we will look at pottery in this class every now and then and sort of really think about that kind of imagination, but also technological knowledge that's passed down from one generation to another. So actually, the use of mud, basically, is just dirt and clay, was really fundamental to people living their everyday lives in the Middle East. And so let's look at how they're using it in different ways. First is pottery, of course. You use clay to make pots for storage, for serving, for cooking. Sometimes you decorate them so it becomes very prestigious, and so on. So the study of pottery is very, very important in this, for this time period. Figurines, they're also making figurines from mud, and even sort of baking them, right? And so these are, we understand there's just such abundance of figurines in these prehistoric cultures that it must have been a very important aspect of everyday life. Architecture, mud brick comes in as an architectural material. They start to make these bricks in order to build walls. And so the beginning of agricultural life, the beginning of village life, also begins with this kind of an architectural technology. Tokens. We're going to see in the next couple of lectures that actually counting business transactions, writing is also taking place on mud. And so in terms of technologies of exchange, technologies keeping a record of your trade and business actually takes place on pieces of clay as well. And architectural models, we find architectural models in these prehistoric sites. It's really hard to understand what was the purpose of making a small model of your house or a little temple, but that's another thing that they used, clay or mud, in making these. So what does this actually eventually take us? The story that we're going to tell in this class is really the story of this kind of human development, and we're going to what aspects of development are we seeing in the Chalcolithic and in the early Bronze Age. First of all, the establishment of farming communities across the Middle East, and this is also happening in Egypt at the same time. And once farming communities is established, there's a lot of forest cutting, and we also see movement of soils and erosion related to that. We see formation of regional affiliations, cultural groups. These pottery, you start to make a fancy pottery, and then it becomes very fashionable, so everyone starts to do this, right? So these are kind of interesting regional identities form around these ceramic styles, shapes, decorations, and technology. We're going to see in the next two lectures emergence of ceremonial and ritual centers, how particular temples actually become centers for large groups of people to come together and mingle, and that's how urbanization really and the construction of monumental architecture really begins. That's also how interregional trade, long-distance trade starts to happen also with these ceremonial centers sponsoring such long-distance trade. And this is also then really associated with the development of complex societies. Social hierarchies start to form, a king, sort of temple administration, priests, craftsmen. So in division of labor starts to come in. Who is going to build the houses, who is going to make pottery, and so on, right? And so that becomes a very important aspect of urban life. That's something that we're going to discuss. So let us look at some of the, this is the final section of my lecture. Let's look at some of those cultures that I just talked about, these late Neolithic and Chalcolithic cultures. The first one is Hasuna, that green area I showed in the map in northern Iraq. So there's a group of settlements that are associated with this Hasuna culture, and they are distinctive. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you architecture, the kinds of buildings that were excavated from these Hasuna-type sites. With both rectangular buildings with outside ovens that you can see, as well as some circular buildings. And so there's an interest. We don't quite understand what's the distinction between a square house and a circular house, but we will come to that. What distinguishes these settlements is this kind of pottery that I'm showing you on the right, a kind of a sort of lightly fired and quite porous sort of gray pot that is decorated with a sharp instrument with these kind of herringbone design, and they're decorated, and these are kind of really big bulbous jars that you find in all of these different sites. You can see that green zone is where these types of pottery was found, and the assumption is that if they're all making similar kinds of pots, then they're talking to each other and some kind of regional identity is forming there. Let's look at Samara, that kind of orange blob. So around a little later than Hasuna, in this orange blob region in northern Iraq, in the late 7th and early 6th millennia BCE, a new material culture affiliation emerges, a new regional identity, and we refer to this in archaeology as the Samara culture. And the Samara culture is really distinctive with these very interesting circular bowls with a painted with a chocolate brown color, with these kind of really unique swirling designs of either geometric or sometimes kind of really abstracted animal images, but always these kind of sort of rotating designs with abstract animal imagery. um, as well as, and in these settlements, which actually have these kinds of bowls, we also find these alabaster figurines that are with inlaid eyes, human-shaped alabaster figurines that were buried with children, in children's graves. Very distinctive aspect. Sometimes they have jewelry like a necklace, and so on. And similarly, in these burials, archaeologists also find these veined alabaster vessels that you are seeing in the slide. What does this all mean? Sort of the Samara culture. There is some kind of a regional sort of identity that's going on here as well. And so, and then later in the 6th millennium, from about 6,000 to 6,000 BCE to 5400, this huge green region is actually unified with what we call the Halaf culture. This is another this is an early Chalcolithic culture that we're seeing that's actually unifying all of this kind of northern Syro-Mesopotamian area. What does that look like? So the Halaf culture is really increasingly refined pottery production. We're starting to see very beautifully decorated and finely fired sort of thin-walled pots, these enormous jars that are actually fired in a different technique in two-chamber kilns. Archaeologists found some evidence for these two-chamber kilns, so they're inventing and improving their pottery technology. And some of these designs we start to see are reminiscent of probably textile designs. You see on the very top, you see some stylized wading birds and some architecture. Architecture that's kind of really illustrating these kind of mat uses. Most probably these kind of reed mats are being used. Sort of some complex architectural representations there. In the second one in the bottom, we see another decorated jar with birds, with sequence of birds on it. So when we look at the architecture of this region at this time, this kind of Hasuna, Samara, Halaf, we see an increasing complexity of house design, centered on the one hand, kind of male symbolism that's associated with hospitality, with ritual, with pastoralism, and kind of bringing animals from the pastures, and then a female symbolism of labor, including sort of food processing, ceramics production, and textile production. And the kind of more productive, sort of craft productive aspects of the household, and this whole complexity of production actually starts to show up in the house. For example, if you look at this house axonometric from Tel Mathur in Iraq, we see how certain sections of the house, so certain rooms of the house, are now dedicated to particular production of particular things, particular technologies. Like in one room you're making pots, in one room you're doing textiles, in one room there's food processing and food preparation going on. But in the center, in the central hallway, where there's a hearth, that's the place for meeting, for eating, ceremonial gathering, and hospitality. So this is the idea of the tripartite house. The tripartite house that emerges in this kind of 5th millennium context in Mesopotamia is where in the center you have this kind of central hall where you have hospitality and ritual and exchange taking place around the hearth. That's where you eat, that's where you accept your guests. And then there are these side rooms on either side which you use for storage, for food processing, pottery production, textile production, and so on. What's really exciting is that this tripartite house plan eventually got adopted for the design of temples, actually, when Mesopotamians start to build shrines and temples to various gods. And I'm going to wrap up my lecture with this by pointing out to the site of Eridu. We talked about Eridu a little bit. So Eridu, which was dedicated to the Enki, the god of fresh waters in early Mesopotamian mythology, in the Sumerian mythology. And this is where we're talking about this from later texts. But Eridu was supposed to be in these later mythological texts. It's talked about as the first city in Mesopotamia. And it was dedicated, it had a temple dedicated to Enki, and it gets represented in later art as well. So Babylonian Epic of Creation talks about this as a reed had not come forth, a tree had not been created, a house had not been made, a city had not been made, all the lands were sea, then Eridu was made. So Eridu was like in the creation myth, the first place where the humans are actually starting to arise, right? So actually Eridu, what's really fascinating is that Eridu was actually excavated in southern Iraq, the site of Eridu, and it's excavated by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar, Seton Lloyd, and Muhammad Ali Mustafa in the 1940s. And what they did is that they discovered a temple, most likely dedicated to Enki, that had 18 different levels. And they excavated each phase, starting with the tiniest shrine that you see in the very middle, and growing eventually to a kind of a complex, temple complex. And you can see that kind of how the building was built over and over again, starting a tiny little shrine and growing into a large complex, building on top of a mound. And so it becomes a kind of like a ziggurat in the end. And it was dedicated to Enki, the god of underground waters, wisdom, and craftsmanship. And he was, Enki is, of course, is very important for us because he's also the god of technologies of making. So I will end my lecture here and say that we will, in the next two lectures, we'll go to Uruk and talk about the first cities, the urbanization, the beginning of urbanization in Mesopotamia. Thank you so much.